So, hello little people on YouTube. Without further ado, here's part 2. That's a rhyme and that's fine. So I'm starting this off with working on the fretboard. Since I have this mountain theme on the guitar, I want to continue that onto the fretboard. So what I'm planning on doing is I want to have like a mountain chain running across the fretboard with the peaks of the different mountains marking the frets in which normally the dots would sit. I'm spraying the fretboard so that I can see better what I'm painting on it, and I use cold paper for doing that. Here I'm laying out my design, making sure that the peaks would really be in the right frets. I was planning on having this 3 to 4 mil thick maple, this figured maple. I was hoping that its figuring would highlight the mountain structure a bit more. So I'm cutting out or dremeling out, actually routing out a lot of these pieces, some bigger, some tinier. And here I'm cleaning the edges, hoping that the pieces would slide into their slots more easily later. But of course that's tedious work, and I don't know how many pieces these were, but a lot. So of course that's routing out the respective shape for the pieces to go in, and this is always fiddling around and trying out the things, checking, rechecking, and since this is not a symmetrical form or something that you can define by a straight edge, it takes a couple of passes and a couple of goes until you finally reach the desired shape. And as I said before, I was planning on doing that with this maple throughout the fretboard because I wanted some impression of a snowy mountainside. But unfortunately, many of these pieces were too brittle. As you can obviously see here, they broke in many places, and I didn't feel like going through with it, so I simply came up with another idea, and for that I just routed out the whole mountain chain, and in the end decided to just epoxy it with this epoxy, and in which I put this coffee brown, gold, not really sparkling but reflecting powder, so that it would kind of reflect nicely once I would oil the fretboard. So I'm making sure I have everything covered. Then I use a heat gun to get out any potential bubbles I may have, and then I just leave it for 48 hours so that it can cure. Here in the workbench you can see that I've got this trio of live inlay. This is made of wood, but this time I used ash. I'm using on a different another build that I'm doing. So what I'm doing with the actual fretboard here is of course flattening it out, getting rid of all the excess epoxy that I have here, making a clean surface so that my radius blocks wouldn't gum up with the epoxy later when I radius the fretboard. Of course, I had cut the fret slots new because the epoxy would go in there, but it's very easy because they're already on and it cuts easily. I think that bound fretboards look really, really good, so that's what I'm doing here, preparing maple for the rosewood, which makes a nice contrast, and I'm cutting the binding at a 45-degree angle, so that I have a nice fit around the fretboard that looks aesthetically pleasing, at least to my eye. I simply cut it here in this easy miter gauge, 45 degrees, and then of course it's gluing the binding on. Even though fretboards with the binding look a lot better, of course they're more work, because later when you're putting in the frets, you've got to cut off the endings, because they just can't go through the binding. So that is an extra step that you have to take into consideration when you do that. So first I hold it in place with a couple of strips of tape, and then I sandwich it between two boards and apply some even pressure with clamps, and that was that. Okay, after gluing the binding on, I make sure that the bottom of the fretboard is dead flat by running it over this even surface on different grids of sandpaper to make sure that there is no proud spot, because this is what goes onto the neck later and what is glued on, and I want this as straight as possible. Here I'm steam bending the binding material for two guitars, one of which is this one, and for this one I'm using Wenge, which is not the sexiest wood to steam bend, as you can see here. It's giving me a bit of trouble, but it's a dark wood, and finding a respective piece of rosewood would be way more expensive, and it's difficult to get them here. So if I have rosewood bindings, that would be, yeah, a lot more expensive, and I don't see the point in that, because what I want is a dark binding, and the Wenge does it for that. And even though it's not very steam bendable for these thin pieces, it's good enough. Makes for a good binding. Okay, now the fretboard is finally ready for putting the radius on it, and I do that by having many steps with different grids of sandpaper. I normally start with a 60 or an 80, depending on how much I have to shape the fretboard, how thick it is. And then I work my way through 120 150, 180, 240, and in the end I'm using 400, and this is as far as I go with the fretboard. Here I'm putting on the next grid and just continue the job. And of course I'm checking for straightness by putting a straight edge on it, see if I've got any gaps, and light comes through. In this case it looks good, and I'm done. I'm rounding off the edges of the binding and the fretboard for a more comfortable feeling when playing. It's very nice to the touch, and it doesn't look bad either. I like it. So I'm just rolling off the edges here, making smooth transitions so that it really feels smooth. Okay, after the box is closed, I run it over this even surface on different grids of sandpaper to make sure that I've got an even flat surface to which the neck will be attached later. So I'm sanding it, checking for evenness again, and I'm checking if some light comes through, and I repeat that process a couple of times until I'm happy with the result. And once that's done, I basically can start putting on the binding. But this one obviously needs more tweaking. Here I'm cutting the binding channel, and in order to set the tool right, you have to start where the neck and the body meet, because that part will be covered by the fretboard later, and there is room for making mistakes, but not in other places. So after I adjusted that, I go round in a first pass, then I check out whether the binding fits, whether I need to make any corrections. And the next step is obvious then. So I'm checking in different places whether my channel is alright. So here I see I need to take another pass because in the first go I didn't get all material out of the channel. So I'm masking the sides here because any glue residue or any glue squeeze out that you might have, you need to take away, and I don't want to do that because it might compromise the thickness of the binding if I sand too much off. So what I'm doing is that I'm protecting as much of the guitar that I can, and the top is already protected because I put on the layers of true oil, and from that I can wash off any glue residue easily. With wooden bindings, I like putting on the glue on both parts in the binding channel and on the binding itself, because I find, at least in my experience, that the wood, the fibers of the wood stand up a bit more due to the moisture on both sides, giving me a tighter or closer fit so that I don't have any gaps. In former times when I just put glue on one side, that sometimes would happen, and all the gaps that you have, even if they're tiny, you will have to take care of later, and this way I avoid that. Okay, here I'm marking where I need to cut the second piece of binding, and I am doing a 45-degree angle cut so that you wouldn't see where the two pieces meet. In former times I did a butt joint with the binding, but you always can see that. So what I have here, I have a 45-degree angle that overlaps, and this way you don't see the joint too easily. And this is also the reason why I start putting on my binding from the bottom of the guitar where the wedge is, so that I can adjust that more easily. So it doesn't matter where the fretboard goes over, so if you see a butt joint there or not, nobody cares. So sometimes apply some pressure where the waist is, so with a clamp, because when you bend the binding the way I do it, not in a jig or whatever, I do it over that jig, but there is still room for warping, that the binding doesn't sit completely flat on it. And this method always helped me to make sure I don't have any gaps there. So it works well. And after that I'm checking out whether the binding sits correctly. And since I make my binding a teensy bit proud, I will have to sand off everything that's proud of the surface. And protecting the top with the true oil worked out really well, so I didn't have to sand off glue residue, but just everything of the binding that was proud, and this worked well. Slightly rounding over the edges here too for a comfortable feeling, because I didn't make any bevel or anything here, but I always round over the edges a bit. The only part where I don't do this is where the fretboard sits, because that would produce a kind of a gap. In former times I did it the whole way around, but now I'm making sure that where the fretboard meets the body, I have a straight fit with the binding. Rough cutting the neck to size. pre-shaping the headstock. And here I'm realizing that I forgot to switch on the suction, which doesn't work too well on this bandsaw anyways. So, making my guide holes for drilling the holes for the threaded bolts that I have. And I do that by using bigger and bigger drills. And I set the depth by putting this tape onto the drill so that I know how far I can go. And I'm doing this to sink in the bolts, and I like them to sit inside the neck to up to 2 millimeters or something, because if I had to do some work later on the neck, need to resend it or take anything off, I don't want the screws to or the bolts to be proud of the surface. So as you can see here, I'm putting them in, but before I completely screw them in, I put in some super glue into the channel for making the wood fibers stand up a bit and thus making for an even tighter fit. So I'm transferring the actual centers of the holes according to the neck now to the body, because it may be that by screwing them in by hand you might go off center a bit, like half a mil or something, but that's not a problem because you can easily adjust for that here when you're doing the neck. So I'm adding the measurements, and with this one hole I was spot on, and with the other one I had a slight deviation, but that doesn't matter a lot, as long as it aligns with the bolts that you have in your neck. So here I'm doing the very same as with the neck, and I'm going for bigger and bigger drills. This is the first dry fitting of the neck in order to see whether my holes align, whether I drilled it nicely. Because if I did that, there should be a very smooth transition from the neck to the body. So here I'm using a straight edge to see whether the fretboard sits nicely on the top, and with this guitar I was very, very lucky and I didn't have to do any big adjustments here. It aligned very naturally and nicely. So here I'm checking out where the bridge would sit. This is just a rough positioning in order to check out whether my neck angles are right. And I test with this straight edge on both sides of the fretboard, on the treble and the bass side, to see whether I'm just touching the top of the bridge, and this worked out really well with this guitar as well. Okay, drilling 2 holes for pins that will hold the fretboard in place while I'm gluing it on later. I do that close to the truss rod channel because this is where the neck is the beefiest in the end, that in case if I drill too far, which I normally don't do, but if it happened, then I wouldn't have problems when I take off material for the neck that the hole would show on the other side. Okay, here I'm outlining the scale length, and since I have to compensate for that later, I'm writing scale length so that I know that's not the actual line, but I will have to add some millimeters for the bass and treble sides. Okay, since I'm gluing on the fretboard onto the top later, I have to make sure that I've got blank wood here, so I'm protecting that from the oil that is going on later. Okay, I'm elongating the sides of the fretboard to have a guide in order to see where my bridge should go later. Because if I did everything correctly, I should have the same distance side to side from these strings to my center line on the guitar. I'm checking the strings. I put the nut in. I'm checking where the strings should run. Checking the distance. And in case I needed to make any adjustments, that would be the moment now. But this looks good as it is. As I said before, I compensated for the bass and treble sides. For the bass side, I go, the literature tells you 3.8 mil. I found that 4 is a safe bet, so that you can have the bridge sit in the right position. And after I positioned it, I cut off the access tape, drilled the outside holes, so for the 2 E strings, because my bridge clamping jig goes through there. Normally I put a block on the inside, but I forgot it this time, so you see how the drill goes right through, which will cause a bit of tear out on the other side, but that's not too bad. I just use a sandpaper. I'll make it even again. And then another couple of layers of true oil, again for protecting the surface of the guitar, because everything else I might be doing now with glue or whatever, I want to avoid that I have to sand off too much in order to protect the binding and the top of the guitar. And I'm rubbing the oil in with some, this sounds to me like 800 grit sandpaper, thus producing a bit of sawdust that fills the pores. Okay, here I'm routing out the 2 deer that I decided to put in this scenery. With the other guitar I only had 1 nibbling on the bridge, if you remember. But this time I decided for a little family. Maybe like Bob Ross says, oh, maybe there is a little deer family in the background of the picture. And here goes. So now this piece is ready for epoxying the shadows of the deer in, and I'm using black epoxy here. And you may notice that I put Play-Doh around the edges of that in order to make the epoxy sit where it needs to sit and not go all over the place, because again, I don't want to hurt my image by having to send off too much. Okay, I don't let that sit for 48 hours because I want the epoxy not to be rock solid before I take off any residue, anything that's proud of the surface. That makes sanding more easy, because if I had a thick layer of epoxy I would have to do a lot of sanding, and then I'm scared again of sanding through the veneer. So I take off as much as I can with a chisel, and then I do the rest here with the orbital sander. Flat sanding it, level with the rest. And at that stage the body is finally ready for real oiling. Ah, that's always very nice to see the grain pop and see the pattern come out. I love oiling. But then again, who doesn't? Okay, now while the body or the true oil is curing, I can already work on the neck, and I start by planing down everything until the point that it almost touches the sides of the fretboard, and then I'm shaping the parts roughly. Do that for both sides. Get as close as I can to the desired shape with the planer, and then I sand it flush with the fretboard with the orbital sander. Okay, checking whether the edges are okay. And then I go into the final shaping of the headstock. Hoping for smooth transitions on both sides and symmetrical looks, of course. And again I realized that I forgot to switch the suction on. Very clever me. Okay, here I'm filing two grooves, one in the first fret, the other around the 12th fret, to determine the depth of the neck that I need. I have 2.1 centimeters in the first fret and 2.4 around the 12th. I say around the 12th because it depends on what design my heel is, how far I can go up there. Okay, measuring whether I am where I want to be. And this looks good. Okay, and then I connect the two lowest spots of the grooves with each other to get a straight line, and I know how much material I have to take off. But before I do that, in order to have a smooth transition, I'm using the spindle sander to go to the bottom of this groove and to make an even transition on both sides, the heel side and the neck side. And in the next step I will have to take off all the material in between. Okay, and I do that with a planer. This sometimes works really well depending on the wood, depending on the figuring, because you don't have a lot of surface to run your planer on, but still it's the easiest way to take off so much material, because sometimes these necks are relatively thick, sometimes the blanks come almost to size. For this one I had to take off quite a bit, checking whether I am straight or whether I have to work some more on it, as I have to do here. Checking for straightness again. And once I'm my knee. And when I'm happy with that, I change the tool. I go to my Shinto rasp and even everything out even more and get closer to the final line where I need to be. Then use sanding blocks. Until in the end I have got a straight connection between the two lowest spots of my grooves that I made. Okay, and here I'm using the router to take off a lot of material so that I don't have to file it off later. Okay, and former times I did that with a saw cutting the groove channel for the truss rods, but only now with my like 50th guitar I realized that I can easily do that with a router. But then I clean out the channel a bit so that it would go straight through the hole that I made in the transverse brace, so that the truss rod would go through easily, which I'm checking here, and it works. And here starts a long process of shaping the neck. I've had different designs throughout the years, and in this video this is actually my last pure butt joint that I'm building, because in the meantime I have changed to mortise and tenon neck joint. But still, even though it's a butt joint, I'm trying to reduce the size of the heel as much as I can. But I'm going from a rather round design or half round design, which I had in former times, to this more angular shape that I stole from driftwood guitars.
Flop.
Sorry, Chris.
Okay. God is watching us. God is watching us. God is watching us from a distance.
I mean, there's nothing much to say here. You can see what I'm doing. I'm shaping the neck. I start with the heel and finish that off more or less before I go to the actual neck. Using different tools, going from coarser to finer and finer. Until finally sanding with different grids of paper. I find circular motions to be the best in order not to tilt and accidentally, when I put some edges to things that you don't want edges on, gluing on the veneer. Oh, what I didn't show in the video is how I sanded the back of the neck at the head plate, but you know how sanding goes. And I've used different techniques for that. Here I'm gluing it on, but in recent builds I tend to iron them on by just putting the glue thin on both pieces, let it sit or let them sit for an hour, and then come back and just iron it on just as I did with the top veneer. Okay, and here we go, starting to shape the neck. I mean, yeah, there are different techniques. You can draw lines. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. For this one, I just did it freehand, because when you've built a couple of guitars, you basically know what you like in a neck and how you want it to be. And so I'm breaking the edge, then I'm breaking the next edge, and in between I'm checking for straightness so that I always have like a reference line that I can follow. So see, I've got to take down some more here, and then I cut the next or break the next edge that I produced. And this I make the formerly rectangular shape more and more round. Checking out, I've got nice transitions. Checking for a consistent development of the radius. And then correcting any mistakes or rather uneven spots that I have. And you can imagine this goes on for quite a while until you're finally satisfied with the shape of the neck. So I'm shaping the volute for a smooth transition here. I'm using scraping blades, sanding blocks and so forth to make it nice and smooth. Okay, obviously drilling the holes that I marked out beforehand, and then I used a little nail to give me some guide holes, and I drill it here, putting glue. And this is some kind of glue from model builders. They use it for, I don't know, whatever. It's a specific plastic glue that works well with the celluloid binding, and in this case the dot markers for the side. Press them in, good tight fit, and then I cut it off with a razor blade. I'm routing out my logo, and I make the head plate always from a leftover piece from the back and sides. And my logo is basically the same, but due to the fact that I hand routed it, it can turn out differently in all of my guitars, even though I'm quite used to doing that. But sometimes, depending on the material, if the wood is a bit softer or harder, it can go in this or that direction. Here I'm using this technique that I talked about earlier, namely just putting glue on both pieces that need to be glued together, let it sit for an hour, then come back and iron it on. I didn't do that for the whole headstock because I was not very clever here with this. Because you can, if you do it like that in a layering, you can only use one piece at a time. So I did it for the first, but for the actual head plate I glued it on old style with clamps. storing the slot for the nuts. This sometimes works really well and the piece pops out easily, and sometimes I've got to work my way around it using chisels and files to make it finally fit. This was a more difficult piece because when I glued it on, I forgot to mask the part where the actual saddle goes, so some glue got there and I glued some of the wood onto this piece, and now I have to clean it all up. Make a nice straight channel and then put in the nut. Okay, due to the fact that I have this sandwich technique, I cut an angle, in this case of 45 degrees with a router, to make the different layers show. And here I've got the maple neck, then I've got a layer of, what is it, amaranth, or what you might say, purple hearts, and on top, of course, the soft maple from the back. Don't you ever please. Ooh. Looking nice. Very nice indeed. Okay, I have changed my way of producing to first oiling the neck and later drilling the holes for the machine heads, because if I do that beforehand and then I start oiling, a lot of oil goes in the holes and it comes out the other side and makes runs, and no matter how you position the neck for the true oil to cure, that will always happen. So I normally do that. In the end with this build it was a mix. I did a couple of layers here, then drilled the holes, and then in the end did a couple of more layers. So I'm drilling the holes for the machine heads, but this is merely a guide hole, it's not complete thickness, this is only 6 mil. And then I use this cone drill set to the right depth so that it will give me a 10 mil hole, and I drill from both sides. And due to the guide hole that I have, it will align perfectly. So giving it the last layer of true oil. And then the neck can sit for a week. And until it's cured, I'm taking care of other things. Here, I'm putting the radius of the top onto the bridge so that I can glue it on with a tight and nice fit later. And then I'm routing off the veneer that I just put on beforehand, because I want the bridge to be glued to the guitar top and not to the veneer itself, in case that the veneer doesn't stick in places which I don't know. I don't think so, but to make sure that I've got good solid contact bridge to top, I'm routing that out, cleaning the channels, and then just put in the bridge there. And that seems like a great fit. Cleaning my drill holes for my bridge clamping jig that I have here. And then this goes on. I like those little things, they're really very handy and they give the whole operation a very clean thing. In former times I used bigger clamps for doing that, but then you would have to design something for the inside that you don't have the bracing, and with those it's a piece of cake.
To tell me she's scared just like me. Always free my little arms.
So preparing the neck for glue up. Okay, aligning it correctly, and I can see that because I've got the tape under the fretboard that I cut before, so I just have to make it match, and then I know I'm my center line. And here again I forgot something. Normally I put my radius block with the 14 foot radius on, and then I clamp the clamps, but it works this way as well. With a block you may have even more even pressure on all, but 4 clamps for this relatively small piece of wood is good enough, I find. Okay, removing the tape and any glue, and then this can sit and cure. Nothing much to say here, installing the machine heads, align them, and then I drill the holes for the screws in the back. And I set my drill to the right depth so that I know once the plastic touches the machine head, I'm at the right depth. I have to be careful when you're screwing them in, because no matter how good your tuners are, these screws are tiny, and it happened to me twice already that I just screwed the heads off. That's because I'm so strong. So I'm cleaning the fretboard of any potential glue residue I have from putting in the frets. Level the frets. Crown the frets again, and this time I didn't put masking tape on. I just do it this way that I do it and immediately suck away any metal that comes off. Because sometimes I find that the masking tape sticks to your, or gums up your fret file, and I don't like that. Rounding off the edges, fret ends for a smooth feeling. And then the process of polishing the fret starts. I normally go from 600 to 800 to 1000 steel wool, and then I go with the Dremel, and I use polishing compounds and go over each fret. Some of you who've watched my previous videos, you know that this is a job I really am not very fond of, but it needs to be done, and it's a very important thing to make your guitar play well. Okay, drilling the other holes for the pins to go in. Okay, here I'm just influencing the break angle and making slots for the string to run or to ease into the bridge. And of course, some more oil. Here it's true oil for the bridge to give it a nice shine that goes along with the top of the guitar. And I use lemon oil for the fretboard. And these new woods are very, very dry, and they are very hungry for the oil, so you've got to do that a couple of times until the wood is actually saturated so that it's good to go. As I said before, I was very lucky with this guitar because when I wanted to adjust the action, I didn't need to do anything, so it just fit automatically with the nut. The only thing I had to do for intonation is to file the saddle a bit. And that's the last thing. Oh, this sounded as if I spat, but it was actually puffing. So here we are with the finished guitar. We've got a Sitka spruce top underneath this onlay. Then we've got ambrosia maple or soft maple for the back and sides, maple neck, bone, nut and saddle, and rosewood pins. It's strung up with 11s, phosphor bronze strings, the cheapest of the cheap. And I will exchange the pins later for bone pins and then make a second video in which we see what the difference is. What the difference is with the different pins. Okay, and now with the bone pins.